So,
Got it?
yep, we are good. So welcome everybody. My name is Dr. Colleen Ehrlich. I'm the immediate past president for the Colorado Association for Gifted and Talented. And with us tonight is Dr. Temple Grandin. So Temple Grandin is a professor of animal science at Colorado State University. Facilities she has designed for handling livestock are used by many companies around the world. She has also been instrumental in implementing animal welfare auditing programs that are used by McDonald's, Wendy's, Whole Foods, and other corporations. Temple has appeared on numerous TV shows such as 2020 and Prime Time. Her books include Thinking in Pictures, Livestock Handling and Transport, and the Autistic Brain. Her books, Animals in Translation and Visual Thinking, have been on the New York Times bestseller list. Temple was inducted into the National Women's Hall of Fame in September 2017, and in 2022 was named a Colorado State University Distinguished Professor. So with just great admiration, I welcome you, Dr. Grandin, to Conversations with CAGT, and it is all yours.
Well, it's great to be here. And what I want to do is talk about different ways that people think. A student can be really gifted in one area and have a big deficit in another area. So I'm going to talk about some of the science behind different kinds of thinking. And that's what I discussed in my new book, Visual Thinking, The Hidden Gifts of People Who Think in Pictures, Patterns, and Abstractions. And we can go on to the next slide. And the first step is realizing that thinking's different. And kids that are gifted often have an extreme skill in one area, like math, or maybe art, or maybe mechanical things. And the first step is realizing that different thinking exists. I was shocked when I found out that other people didn't think in pictures like me. In fact, in my 20s, one of the things I did when I started studying animal behavior was looking at what cattle were seeing when they were going through the chutes. I'll just show you a picture on the next slide of a shadow of me with my iPhone scaring some cattle. And a lot of people didn't think to look at what cattle were seeing. Well, if you think verbally, you'd be less likely to think about this. And I didn't know that other people thought in words until I was in my late 30s. Let's go to the next slide. Now, in looking at engineering, engineers who are mathematicians will calculate risk of something going maybe wrong on this launch pad. A visual thinker can see risk. And the thing is, we need both kinds of thinkers. And I got a chance to visit this launch pad 5.5 years ago. This is the launch pad that NASA's Artemis rocket flew off from. And we were under there at 7 o'clock in the morning. They were using the inside of the base as a workshop to work on fueling equipment. And there's kind of a stairway in the back. And I'm going to show you what came down that stairway on the next slide. And a raccoon came out of there. He was living in there. And I saw equipment in there that I don't really want a raccoon around, electric panels, all kinds of stuff. And they didn't know he was in there. That's an example of seeing risk. Now let's go to the Fukushima nuclear power plant disaster. Well, we can also talk about this. Let me just talk about Fukushima a little bit. They had done a beautiful job of making that reactor earthquake-proof. It shook and it shook and it shook and everything was fine. 20 minutes later, the tsunami drowned it, because they didn't see water going onto the site and drowning the electric emergency cooling pump that's not going to work underneath the water. They needed watertight doors. You see how simple that is? I just saw that. Now, the reason I'm showing these two scientific mixing devices is these are used for mixing things in labs. And it's very important which one you use. And when you write a paper, you need to tell which one you used, because it changed the results of cancer studies. One lab used the magnetic stirrer, which is kind of a stronger mixer, and the other uses gentle little Ferris wheel contraption, and that totally changed the results. I review a lot of journal articles. People are going really overboard on fancy statistics, but then they don't tell me what breed of animal they used. What did they feed them? How did they house their cat or their pigs, whatever that animal was? Methods matter, and they can change the results of research. You see, these are things that I see. Let's go to the next slide. There's 3 different basic kinds of thinking, and in my book on visual thinking, I've got a whole chapter, lots of scientific references, and we'll go on to the next slide. I am what's called an object visualizer. I think in photorealistic pictures. And if you saw the HBO movie about me, it shows exactly how I think in pictures. Now, the kinds of things that my kind of mind's good at is inventing mechanical equipment. A lot of people I worked with on equipment in these big meatpacking plants were either autistic, dyslexic, or ADHD. And there's a lot of gifted kids that are somewhat on the autism spectrum. Art, photography, working with animals. Art and mechanics, they go together. Seems strange, but art and mechanics, those two things go together. So you've got the kid who's addicted to video games. One of the ways to get them off is motors. And they're going to find that motors are more interesting than video games. We have a gigantic shortage right now of highly skilled trades. I know people that have huge businesses in metal fabrication and construction that started with a single high school welding class. You see, the visual thinker is a different kind of thinker because the thing I'm bad at is algebra. I can't do algebra. And most of the people I worked with that were inventing all kinds of mechanical devices also couldn't do algebra. But the thing is, you need me to find the raccoon. And I'm sure they got it out of there before the Artemis launched. Let's go to the next slide. Now, this is your spatial visualizer. This is your typical STEM kid. Mathematics, music, science. They think in patterns. They don't think in pictures. I think in photorealistic pictures. Good at computer programming, good at engineering, but they're good at the mathematical side of engineering. Nobody saw the water coming into Fukushima. Simple, old-fashioned, watertight doors, and it would not have happened. An ancient, simple technology to protect an electric pump that you need very, very badly. Let's go to the next slide. Verbal thinker, writing, sales, psychologists, lawyers, teachers, and they think mainly in words. And I was shocked when I found out that people think mainly in words, because for me, words describe things I'm looking at. Let's go to the next slide. Now, here's research that shows that different kinds of thinking exist. And there's a chapter where I just go over the research. And where this research has been done is looking at the object visualizer like me versus the mathematical visualizer. And there really are different kinds of thinking. Mathematicians are good at a lot of pattern things that go in sequences. Where I'm good at things where I can just look at whole pictures of things. But these different kinds of thinking really do exist. Let's go to the next slide. And a lot of people are mixtures, but you get a kid with a label, even some of these gifted kids, extreme in one area and maybe bad in another area. Some of the kids that are super smart in math have problems with reading. And the other thing about the math kids, when I'm seeing a problem, I've had lots of parents come up to me really frustrated. Well, the teacher's making them do the math sequentially and show the steps. That's not how they think. Okay, I see you nodding your head there. That is not how they think. And then I wonder, why does a veterinarian need to have algebra? I've talked to so many students who want to be a veterinary nurse. They're on their second and third algebra class. Well, I had a dean tell me that you need it for logical thinking. Well, it's not how I think. I can just see how something works. Let's go to the next slide. It turns out I've got some big visual thinking circuits in my head, really big ones, big graphics card. Go to the next slide. Just another picture of the visual thinking circuits. And then we can go on to the next slide. And let's look at how different kinds of thinkers take in information. Okay, let's say I wanted to teach you how a water pump works. The object visualizer would like to look at the pump or videos or pictures. The verbal thinker wants to read about it. And the mathematician tends to look at both of these things. But the mathematician tends to not see the pump picture quite so clearly. This is an interesting study that shows how students go about creating a planet. This was an art project. It had done with art high school students, science students, and humanities or word students. And they were in teams and invent a planet. And the visual thinkers would come up with all kinds of fantastic stuff, crystals and polar bears, all kinds of stuff. Science students would make it round, describe the gravity in the atmosphere. And the words thinkers just kind of did splotches. But the thing that blew my mind is the word thinkers did absolutely no planning, where the visual thinkers and the math thinkers did lots of planning. You know, there's a lot of big verbal concepts like inclusive classroom. But how do you actually do that? You see, my mind thinks is bottom up. I can think of examples where an inclusive classroom worked, other examples where it didn't work. Then I can start to categorize them to figure out what made it work and what made it not work. Let's go to the next slide. But this lack of planning. Verbal thinkers overgeneralize. I don't know how many times people say to me, how do I teach autistic kids? Well, I don't even know the age. That, that's I've got to know if I'm working with 3-year-olds here or somebody older. There's always overgeneralizing. And I see this in legal stuff. I see terrible terms like reasonable, something being reasonable in legal code. I don't know what that means. Or you say handle cattle properly. I don't know what that means. I like clear stuff like traffic rules written clearly. And the object visualizers and the mathematicians may keep a few too many details, but the verbal thinker takes out too many details. Broad concepts without figuring out how are you actually going to do it. I just talked to some policy people just the other day in the state about disability stuff. And I said, let's figure out something targeted. Like one of the things was person on disability loses their disability payment and loses health insurance along with it. And they can't pay for the health insurance. Yeah, let's work on the health insurance issue. You see, that's something specific. Let's go to the next slide. Now, the early inventors, if you go back to when the patent office started, it was all mechanical devices. In fact, when the patent office started, you had to give the patent office a model of your invention, all mechanical things. And the grain harvesting equipment in the beginning was invented by a blacksmith. The Wright brothers were bicycle mechanics. Now it'd be interesting to find out how good they are in algebra. But these are strictly mechanical devices. And I call this kind of engineering the clever engineering department. And we actually have got a real serious problem right now with losing skills in this department. Look at people fixing elevators. They're getting older and older and older. And I've been on some very questionable elevators real recently. Let's go to the next slide. And this is Chuck Hall, who invented the 3D printer. Now, what people forget about a 3D printer, it's a mechanical device controlled by a computer. It's not a computer. It's a mechanical device controlled by a computer. It's a really important difference. Let's go to the next slide. Well, the real problem with things that we're not making, and it goes back to our educational system, where are the clever engineers? Those people out in the shop that can just design anything mechanical. Let's go to the next slide. Over half of large industrial 3D printers are from Europe. Let's go to the next slide. The state-of-the-art electronic chip-making machine is from Europe. Here's the inside of it. The physics behind this was invented in a university in the US. The next slide is going to show all the gadgets all over it that my kind of mind is going to understand. This is from Holland. And it goes back to their educational system. In 9th grade, you can go university or go tech. We're not making this, even though we invented the basic physics for it. You see, in engineering, you've got the people out in the shop that often don't get enough credit, maybe barely graduated from high school, but they can build anything, and you need them. Let's go to the next slide. And the latest electron microscope, it's from Germany. And we can go on to the next slide and see the parachute and I'll get to that later. This is a state-of-the-art pork processing plant. In 2019, before COVID shut everything down, I went to 4 places that made me realize there's a lot of stuff we're not making. And most of the equipment you see there on that floor is from Holland and some from Quebec. And I saw 2 of these plants. And then I went to a big poultry plant, brand new one, and the equipment was all from Holland. And then up in Canada, they just built another one, and all the equipment was from Holland. We are not making it anymore. And there's a lot of food processing equipment now that comes from Italy. You're not talking about coming from a low-wage country, a bunch of cheap clothes. You're talking about coming from a high-wage country. We used to build all this stuff. And the big mistake that was made was taking out shop classes, taking out the hands-on classes. Now, I just got back from a trip to Nebraska, and they've kept a lot of these classes, and they need to keep them. Let's go to the next slide. The Mars parachute was made on fabric woven in the UK on high-tech European looms. We sewed it here, but we did not make the fabric. Let's go to the next slide. And then I finally went to the Steve Jobs Theater. Structural glass walls, the wiring is in the seams. It's from Italy and Germany, and the carbon fiber roof is from Dubai. And I'm standing in the middle of it screaming, we don't make it anymore. And there's a connection here between these things and our educational system. You know, we have a big company here called Corning Glassworks. I went there probably 7 or 8 years ago. Well, they're shutting down all the R&D. They should have made this. Yeah, we're getting too much into, you know, quick, short-term stuff. Let's go to the next slide. We've paid the price for taking out the hands-on classes: art, sewing, home economics, music, woodworking, welding, theater, auto shop. I put all these things back in. The other big mistake that was made, and that was made at the Corning Glassworks and other companies, is shutting down in-house engineering departments. I have the most familiarity with the meat industry, but we used to have a giant in-house engineering department called the Montfort Fab Shop. They used to build all the equipment when it was Montfort's. And then in between Montfort's and JBS, it got shut down. JBS did not do it. And they, in the short run, it made money to shut it down and just contract the work out. But then as the clever engineers retired, then what do? And there's one shop that's left, and they are gouging big time. And we're not making stuff that, you know, in the early 90s, in the 90s said, we just made it all. Let's go to the next slide. I'm worried about my kind of mind being screened out. Absolutely can't do algebra. It's too abstract. And I'm seeing, you know, people being kept out of all kinds of degrees like photography and film. You need algebra for that? I don't think so. And I've talked to a lot of photographers that were dyslexic. They were the kid that had bad learning in school, and they discovered cameras. And they've been very successful professionally. And a lot of community colleges, one of the big barriers on getting a 2-year degree is algebra. Now, there's some things you need algebra, but mechanics, you don't need it. Art, you certainly don't need it. And I don't think a veterinary nurse needs to have algebra. Dosing of drugs, yes. They have to do that in their sleep. But that's kind of formulas that they can just memorize. Let's go to the next slide. My grandfather was the co-inventor of the autopilot for airplanes, MIT-trained mathematical engineer. And he worked with another person who was probably on the autism spectrum, who came up with this unique, original idea for an autopilot. And the people that made instrumentation for airplanes thought it was ridiculous. But they worked in a loft. They tinkered and they tinkered and they tinkered and they got it to work. It was in every warplane during World War II, but the stolen version was in every plane. They needed a lawyer. They'd had a lawyer, it would not have gotten ripped off. It's just that simple. You see, this is where you need all the different kinds of minds. Let's go to the next slide. Now let's look at the big food processing plants. My kind of mind, you have a person with a drafting technician laying out entire factories. A drafting technician that maybe had a 1-semester course in computer drafting, and they're laying out entire factories, inventing people in the shop, inventing highly mechanized equipment that may have 20 patents each. Now, my kind of mind never messed around with boilers and refrigeration. We didn't understand that stuff. That's for the mathematicians. Make sure the roof doesn't fall down. Power and water requirements. You see, you need to have both kinds of minds. And where we're losing it is in the object visualizers. That's where we're losing it. Let's go to the next slide. Now, when I worked on the visual thinking book, I wrote the rough drafts. You see, a visual thinker is kind of an associative thinker. So where a verbal thinker is more linear. So I'd write the rough drafts, and then Betsy, who's totally verbal, would smooth them all out, really make the wording really good. So we're working together, fully aware of our different kinds of minds. You see, this is where we've got to get collaborations going, because you need to have the different kinds of minds. Let's look at the iPhone, for example. Steve Jobs was an artist. He didn't know how to program. he made up an interface on that phone that you didn't have to get a PhD in engineering to use the phone. And then the mathematicians had to make the phone work. But an artist invented that interface. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, let's say in making a building, the architects are going to make it look nice. The engineers will make it safe, but it won't be very pretty. See, the thing is, you need to have both and recognize the different skills they bring into a project. Let's go to the next slide. 20% of the people I worked with are either autistic, dyslexic, or ADHD, owning metal companies. Now, as I go back and forth between the autism world and the gifted world, I've seen a lot of kids in the gifted world, I'm pretty sure, are autistic. And then I'll see a seminar on learning social skills. But then when I go over to the book tables, there's almost no overlap between the book table for the gifted and the book table for autism. They're in their own little silos, even though there's a lot of crossover. There's a lot of crossover with ADHD and autism, but there's a lot of gifted kids that probably are a bit on the autism spectrum. And the people I worked with, they couldn't do algebra. I've asked them. I don't know if I could graduate from high school in California right now. So what would I do if I couldn't graduate from high school? Let's say somebody waved a magic wand and I'm now 18, low income 18, but I still have my knowledge. Well, I'm going to head for that chip factory because I'll tell you what I want to do in the future. I want to design the next one. And I have seen people do that career path. I have seen that. Let's go to the next slide. I have grandparents that come up to me all the time. They discover they're autistic when the kids get diagnosed. And most of them had good careers: engineering, accounting, pharmacy. They had some good, some really good careers. See, big problem now is a lot of these kids get a label. They're not learning life skills. They're not learning shopping, learning money. Like the way that I learned money is I had to relate what different amounts of money would buy. Now in the 50s, 50 cents could buy a lot. It's like $5 today. And if I could get 5 Superman comics with my 50 cents, but if I wanted a 69-cent airplane, I had to save for 2 weeks. Yeah, I relate different amounts of money. Like, how do I think about really big amounts of money, like $1 billion, $100 billion, $20 billion? Well, $20 billion is about 4 or 5 big airports. See, I got to convert it to something I can see. DIA units. You see, otherwise it's too abstract. You think about it in big airport units. You go, you mean they wasted all the, 4 airports worth of money on that, something that dumb? You see, that makes it real. Okay, let's go to the next slide. What would happen to some of our top innovators in today's educational system? I think they might be less successful. Let's look at Michelangelo on the next slide. And Michelangelo, well, he's on the next slide. Grubby little 12-year-old, dropped out of school. His dad wanted to be a lawyer. He didn't want to be a lawyer. And he didn't want to learn another language to be a lawyer. But he grew up exposed to great art. Every church was commissioning it. So running around seeing this great art, and he grew up with stone cutting tools. And so he got exposed. And they started making stuff. And then he got apprenticed into a studio. You see, it starts out with exposure, then mentoring. I was just talking to my students today in my first class, and I was saying, you need to get out and try different things. Find out what you hate, find out what you like. I get asked all the time, how'd you end up in the cattle industry? Well, I ended up in the cattle industry because I got exposed to it as a teenager. I came from back east. That was a perfect example of getting exposed to it. I had a great science teacher. He got me motivated to study. Another mentor I had was a small contractor starting steel and concrete business who'd seen some of my drawings. Exposure, then mentoring. Kids have got to get out and do a lot of different things. Go to the next slide. Steve Jobs, bullied in school. Einstein, no speech until age 3. I think both of these were probably on the autism spectrum, and I certainly would call them gifted. But you see, the verbal thinkers get too locked into the verbal words. You see, for me, I'm going, well, man, I've seen the same kid that's just like this kid over at the autism conference. A little kind of a geeky, nerdy kid. See, the thing is, autism in its mildest variant is a personality variant. But the problem with the autism label now is you're going from somebody who is gifted to somebody who can't dress themselves. And you put that same name on that. The spectrum is so big, it's just ridiculous. Let's go to the next slide. Thomas Edison probably was autistic. High school dropout. One of the things he did is he learned how to work. A lot of kids today aren't learning how to work. Yes, we need to be doing academics, but I'm seeing kids graduate from college and lose it in the workplace because they never had a job while they're in high school or college. I'm seeing too many parents overprotect their kids. We got to get them out doing things. We need to learn how to work. We need to have a slow transition from the world of school to the world of work. Around 11 years of age, then I start doing volunteer jobs where somebody outside the family is the boss. Okay, the next slide shows another famous person who's on the autism spectrum. And I respect his engineering in electric cars and in rockets. I don't know about Twitter. I just read last night that when the press emails, there's an automatic email with a poop emoji. Oh, come on now, grow up here. It looks like a cute little brown Kong toy that a dog would play with. Yeah, this is where, that's the inner child. And the Tesla car has a special app under emissions. It's the fart app. And when you use the turn signal, it farts, and you can choose different ones like Big Falcon Rocket, things like that. And you say the thing with Twitter, that's a lot more social. Rockets and cars. Maybe he should have just stayed with that because his work in rockets and cars is not wonderful. Let's go to the next slide. A Nobel Prize winner was 50% more likely to have an arts and crafts hobby compared to other scientists. That's another reason for keeping in creative classes. I don't know. There's some schools where I'm thinking about algebra, English, and sports. I mean, sports is a good thing, but I'm seeing so much emphasis on sports that they're canceling band, and you're more likely to get a career in music than you are in sports. Let's go to the next slide. All right, let's look at some tips for working with minds that are different. If I was a computer, I have a very small processor. I'm like a phone with only one bar service. So I'm going to have problems with rapid multitasking. That is going to be something I'm going to have a whole lot of trouble with, rapid multitasking. Don't put me on the McDonald's takeout window or a chaotic store during the holidays. The other thing is I cannot remember verbal sequential information. I have to write it down. And I heard a sad story where, and this is a recent right now, of an electrician's apprentice that lost a job because the boss goes, yak, 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 ceiling light dimmer switch. You see, if it had just been written down, can't remember fast verbal sequence. And vagueness doesn't work. But those are things where I would have problems. Let's say I had to learn a job like being a gate agent at the airport. I'd have to sit down and have someone let me write down the keystrokes for gate checking a bag, let's say. I'd have to write those down. Okay, print a boarding pass, write them down, and I'd have to go home and practice them. Probably make up jingles for different things. Have the pilot's checklist right here. Try not to use that. I don't want to use that front passengers. But there's other people where someone can just go boom, 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 and they can learn it. I don't have the processor speed for that. But I'll tell you right now, frozen jet bridges, I'd be the expert on that. And I would know how to fix that, and I would know how to prevent them. You see, that's something I can see it as it telescopes together, some ice strips down and freezes it together. I can just see that. And then maybe if I pull it back and I leave 1 inch like that, they won't stick together and freeze. See, those are things that I've already thought about. Yeah, you see, the frozen jet bridges, I've been on the plane while they've messed with frozen jet bridges, and you're not going to make your connection. So get kids out, get them out doing things. So we'll go on to the next slide. I'm going to start telling you about how I got my business started. Let's look at what is the goal of education. Where is a kid 10 years after high school? What are they doing? 10 years after high school, and after I got my master's, I was out doing my first really big projects. And one of the things I figured out really early on is doors to opportunity. There's a scene in the HBO movie, Temple Grandin, where I go up to the editor of the magazine and I get his card. And I realized if I wrote for that magazine, that would open up a lot of doors. A lot of people don't see those opportunities. Let's go to the next slide. Well, that's some of my drawings. So the way I sold jobs was showing off my work. Interview for me was simply spread out the drawings, show off the work, sell the work. I know a drafting technician I worked with in the 90s. He took a 1-semester community college class. He took a homework assignment out and showed it to the engineering department back when these companies had engineering departments. He laid out 3 factories. Total visual thinker. Let's go to the next slide. Now, this is the drawing that I used to sell the Cargill Corporation. I designed the front end of all the Cargill beef plants. And I sent Mr. Fielding, the head of Cargill, this drawing, a big 2-foot by 3-foot drawing, some pictures, trade magazine articles. I simply sent him a portfolio of my work. That's how I sold jobs. Let's go to the next slide. And that was one of the pictures that was sent. We can go on, I'll show you some other pictures I put in the, that's the aerial photograph of the recreation of one of my systems for the movie. I love the fact they had my project, and that was my brochure. And then the final slide I'm going to show right now is just another picture that I put into the packet. But we need to show the work. And I will talk to parents, and they'll say, well, my kid's really good at art, or my kid's really good at this. And I said, do you have pictures on your phone? And they don't have any pictures on the phone. Sell a job for your kid. They don't seem to be thinking that way. Well, I've gone about 35 minutes, and I'd really like to open it up to questions, and I hope we got quite a few people on there for questions. I'm going to stop here on these slides.
Yeah, we have, we've been kind of bouncing around between 35 and 40 people, which is great. If you have any questions, then please pop them down.
I can put them in the chat also. Yep. I'll put the chat up.
Yep. So if you put it in the chat, then because they're not on, we're live on Facebook, then I can.
You can't do the chat. Okay. All right. I didn't realize.
Well, so I have the chat, so I can just tell them to you, and then you can answer them, and then they'll be able to.
You can just tell me the questions.
Yep. I think one piece that we heard was it's, you know, the idea of gifted and autistic, so the twice exception.
Well, I think there's a lot of overlap, but the thing is, a kid ends up in one place or he ends up in the other place, and there's very little crossover. And I think there's a lot of crossover. As a visual thinker, I'm going, wait, I'm seeing the same kind of kid over at the gifted conference as I'm seeing at the autism conference. Now, the only difference is that the nonverbal and the more severe individuals with autism will be at the autism conference. But there's 20% of the kids, I'd say they're the same.
Yeah, and I think that that's an interesting point. And for sure with gifted, especially when we start to look at twice exceptional. So like
yes, that's
dyslexia, autism, ADHD for sure. But this person had said, Christy Perry had said, when students are doing dual credit college and high school at the same time, there's not enough time to work. So if these kids can do college, why do they still need to go do the high school stuff that keeps them from experiencing and working? So I think her question is more around like your take around if they are in high school, are dual enrolled in college, and doing both of those things at once might be taking up so much of their time that it's limiting other opportunities.
Well, the other thing is they can do work in the summertime. Are they doing this all summer?
So if they are in concurrent enrollment, then typically it would be during the school year, although they could take some college courses in the summer as well.
Yeah, you see, and the other thing is a lot of duplication between some of the introductory college classes and the advanced high school classes. And some of that redundancy, it doesn't make much sense.
Right. And I think that where they're coming from is that by doing both, that redundancy is taking up so much time that it's then limiting them from doing some of the other things that you were suggesting.
Well, and that's true. But on the other hand, I see a lot of parents, especially in the autistic community, where they just won't let go. And the number of kids, teenagers, who have never shopped by themselves, gone into a store and just bought something and interact with the store staff. I'm seeing this all the time. And this is really bad. And they get into where they just can't let go to let their kid do the most mundane things. And then the kid, when they try to get on their own, they doesn't work.
I agree, actually. So one of the notes that you had said was teaching them, teach them to learn how to work. And I had made the note also, teach them to learn how to fail.
Well, that's right, because sometimes you do fail. And when I was a little kid, I would spend hours and hours and hours making little bird kites. And I have another book called Calling All Minds. I've got it right here, Calling All Minds. And this is my elementary school projects, where I spent hours tinkering with bird kites and parachutes. And I mean, hours trying different designs, trying to get the parachute to open up more efficiently. And yeah, some of the designs did fail. And then I would have to work on changing the design. But kids just aren't doing that. Tinkering. Another mistake I'll see is I'll see a kid super good in Legos and nobody thought to introduce tools. That's another big problem that I'm seeing.
And I think I see, speaking of Legos, some very young students who are able to do these, 4,000 piece,
yeah, that's right.
4,000 piece Legos, if they follow every direction exactly as it's written, but if you give them a box full of Legos, they don't know where to start.
Well, and then there's others who give them a box full of Legos and they create something new.
Exactly.
Yeah, you see, that's kind
how
of
do we get the kids there?
Well, and then you might just give them a box full of Legos and instead want you to just invent something.
Mm-hmm. So Cindy Ward had a question that you made a comment that the spectrum is too broad. What recommendations do you have that would lead to more effective supports for students in schools?
Well, one of the things is you got to get specific on what the exact support you need. Now, one of the worst sort of architectural problems is flicker in LED lights. I'm going to guess that maybe 10% of autistics, gifted, ADHD can see flicker on certain fluorescent lights and on LED lights. It drives them crazy. So you whip out that new phone and photograph the lights in slow motion video. Wave like this, and then I'm going to play it back. I got to make sure I play it back in slow motion. And if you have that in the classroom for certain students, that's going to be a big problem, a really big problem. Some will need extra time on a test. Let's look at what the specific accommodation that's needed. There's, again, it gets way too generalized. And then also there's a time when you can start to fade out the aid. Mm-hmm. There's been problems where students that had an aid in high school showing them in college, and all of a sudden there's no aid. That's not going to work. Mm-hmm. But let's get specific, and let's go back to the pilot's checklist, where if I write down the sequence of things I have to do, and there's been people that have lost good jobs because the boss went yak, 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 and then something was done wrong. Let me write down the sequence. Mm-hmm. I need an external working memory.
I think it's so interesting when you were saying that too, especially when you made the correlation that so many educators are verbal thinkers.
That's right.
And how many educators, or obviously educators are parents as well, give those vague directions to students, like behave, or the generalized of well, just make sure that it's high quality work. And people don't understand what that means because it's so vague when you say things like that.
You see, one thing about visual thinking, it's not vague. Okay, something vague would be if you had 100 problems on a math test, really good scores, 90 of them, right? Mm-hmm. You see, now that's something specific. That's not vague. Traffic rules are not vague. There's a speed limit and it's measured with a device. Drunk driving is not vague. It's measured with a device. Please don't just say, oh, I don't think you were driving at the prudent speed. It's measured.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and just
clear.
How even when I think some parents and some educators think they're being clear, they really might not be being clear at all.
Well, verbal thinkers overgeneralize all the time. They say, how do I teach autistic kids? I don't know if you're talking about 2-year-olds, elementary school? Are they verbal, nonverbal? What is the problem? Now, the things I've told you about the working memory, that goes across a lot of different labels. That and the problems with the sequencing and the problems with the rapid multitasking. I simply don't have the processor speed for that. So when I learned how to drive, I had to spend a lot more time practicing on dirt roads to get that driving of that car into motor memory. You see, now once I get that into motor memory, I don't have to think about steering or using the gas, then I can worry about the traffic.
So when we think about
a lot more practice in a totally safe place like giant parking lots and back roads.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate that because my son's about to turn 16, so he gets his license in a week. So we have been doing a whole lot of practicing in all of those places that you just saw.
Yeah, that's where you do practicing.
Absolutely. So then thinking about that, we did have another question about twice exceptional students and thinking about in particular girls, and do twice exceptional girls have any unique needs that you have kind of experienced as opposed to 2E boys?
Well, if autistic girls, often the symptoms aren't as obvious sometimes. Then one of the big problems they get is they sometimes get into abusive relationships because they want to have a relationship. But where people on the autism spectrum are going to have friends is through shared interests. It could be theater, it could be music, it could be robotics club. Like, for example, in robotics, I would work on the physical robot. Somebody else is going to do the programming. You see, that's the different kinds of minds working together.
Right. Which I completely agree. And so have you heard in Colorado, because we, well, not just in Colorado, but really across the United States, there's been this big push in reading and implementing the science of reading. So thinking about that, Mira Stolberg-Halpert has the question that one of the big confrontations is between visual thinkers and the science of reading. And if you have any suggestions there.
Well, some kids learn whole word. They'll just learn whole words. That didn't work for me. I learned with phonics. And I've looked at some of the complicated stuff that's online. You know what Mother did? She pinned the alphabet up on the wall and just say A. A as A and A. B is ba. C is ka. D, E is and E. And then she had got a book worth reading, like The Wizard of Oz, something worth reading that I might want to read. And she'd read a page, stop in a really interesting place, and then sound out a few words. Then she'd cue me about the E on the end. It was not complicated. And now you get into reading comprehension. There's different levels of reading comprehension. And with a lot of these kids, let's just start at the vocabulary level. Jane went to the store and bought carrots. Okay, Jane is a person. Connector words, I kind of just figure out how to use them. They don't mean that much. Store, I see King Soopers. Carrots, I see the produce counter. And the connector words I don't say. So, but then where the autistic kid's going to have more problems. If I said Jane went to the store and bought birthday cake mix and candles. Okay, now there's another reason here. What is Jane planning to do? You see, I'm going up to another level of comprehension. Let's start them with the simple comprehension that's based on the vocabulary first.
So phonics helped you, and then visualizing.
Yeah, I went from one semester of Mother working with me on phonics after school, 4 afternoons a week. I went from no reading in the 3rd grade to 6th grade level reading in 1 semester.
Excellent.
Yeah, some of that stuff, we just get it too complicated too.
Yep.
With some of the phonics lessons, I mean, I look at some of the stuff, I look it up online, I'm going, oh, you got to be kidding. Because what Mother did was so simple. And first of all, start with a book.
And very clear.
That, that I'm going to be interested in.
Mm-hmm. For sure. So Patty Dennison Reinerson said, how do we encourage parents who are disillusioned about the system's focus on getting right answers over solving problems and thinking creatively? How can we advocate for change in the system?
Well, that's getting rather vague. Let's figure out some specific things. I talked about putting all the hands-on classes in the school. I just went to a wonderful school in Nebraska. They had the most fantastic ceramics shop. They had welding and auto mechanics. They had ceramics, welding, and auto mechanics all together, which I thought was kind of cool. And they had kids doing some really great stuff. And you can work some academics in math and arithmetic and stuff into cooking. You've got to measure. But I think one of the worst things the schools ever did was taking out all the hands-on classes. Also, they provide places where students that think differently can show off their skills. Well, he's really good at fixing cars, or he's really good at making stuff with welders, or really good with cooking or art. You know, in theater, for example, I didn't care about the acting, but I loved making sets and costumes. That's technical theater. That's something that can turn into a career.
Yeah, I can agree more, and really into that application piece, right? So in the career tech ed fields, how are we applying everything that you're saying?
I went to career fair just recently, and for kids to think differently, and the special ed teacher was upset because they wouldn't let this kid take shop because he had a special ed label. Well, I can tell you 20% of the people I worked with in the shops were special ed kids.
Mm-hmm.
They used to say the stupid kids take shop. It's not the stupid kids. It's a different kind of thinking. They just see how to solve a problem.
So then thinking of that, because we do have a question around that, if there's an older child, somebody had asked the question that where can you go for an evaluation, especially for older children?
Well, see what they do. Now, in this book, there's a visual and verbal test in here. Also, the references are in there for the object visualizer and the visual spatial. Things like the paper folding test I'm not good at because it puts too big of a load on working memory. But a test called the grain test, where, let's say, you look at something like a tennis racket and a grape. Okay, the tennis racket has a tighter grain because if I try to shove a grape through it, it's going to squash. The grape's fatter than the width of the tennis racket strings.
Yeah.
So that's an example of the grain test.
Okay, awesome.
You see, I visualized that, and I do really well on that.
Mm-hmm.
But I think you read the chapter in my book, Visual Thinking, about the different kinds of minds. There's tons of references in there, but also just look what the kid does. See, this is where if you expose kids to enough stuff, you can see what they're good at.
So I think that that's a great segue into just the last little bit of our time together. I know you have some of your books there, and I don't know how familiar everybody is with all of them, but would you mind just holding them up and kind of giving like a brief little synopsis to them, including your
Well, I have my new book, Visual Thinking, The Hidden Gifts of People Thinking Pictures, Patterns, and Abstractions. And I think this is a book that your group would be really, really interested in. Then I've got books on animal behavior. In fact, you might be interested in Animals in Translation. This is Using the Mysteries of Autism to Understand Animal Behavior. See, animals don't think in words. They're sensory-based thinkers. And then there's my autobiography, Thinking in Pictures. I think a lot of people would find that helpful. And then I've got livestock books that you're probably not going to be so interested in. Autistic Brain also talks about some of the different kinds of thinking. There's also a good chapter in here on sensory issues. I think that be helpful for some people. So basically what my books are about autism, and they're about livestock. And there's a book here that might be of interest called Live Different, Not Less. And this is people that later on in life discovered they were autistic. And in relationships, that opened up a lot of doors. It explained a lot of things. I think in some cases, the diagnosis is holding kids back on the job front. And then I've got my children's book, Calling All Minds. And then I'm Calling All Minds, and then I have another book that I don't have right beside me called The Outdoor Scientist. Get kids out observing stars, observing animals, get them out in the outdoor world. Outdoor Scientist. And those books, the Calling All Minds and The Outdoor Scientist, those would be good for second grade up to 6th grade.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much. And thank you everybody for joining us here today. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.